Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Derek Snyder, Senior Director for Science Partnerships and Outreach at the American Psychological Association. Thank you for joining us today, and please let us know where you're from by saying hello in the chat. Today's program is an episode of Science Showcase, an APA webinar series on hot topics in psychological science research, presented firsthand by the authors who did the work. We hope you'll continue to join us in future episodes as we learn from experts and emerging leaders, explore terrific new models and methods, and explore psychological science that inspires. Before we get started today, I want to share a few quick announcements. First, many thanks to those who submitted questions for today's program. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. You can also ask questions during the program by using the Q&A feature on your dashboard, and we'll add them to our list. Also, because we have speakers coming from different places, you may need to adjust your volume here and there when others are speaking. Finally, this program is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive an email with a link to the recording in about 2 weeks. This morning, I am pleased to have two experts on fan behavior, and that links well to our theme, which is the magnetism of March Madness. As many of you know, March Madness, the NCAA basketball tournament, is underway right now. And for those who've been keeping track, many underdogs have been moving forward in the bracket. And so there have been some upsets, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, and lots of fan behavior being displayed. And so our speakers today will give us some insight on why fan behavior is such a popular thing for people and what it says about our ability to create relationships and affinities. Speaking with us today are Marco Iacoboni, who's a professor of psychology and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles. In addition, he serves as the director of the Neuromodulation Lab at the Amundsen Lovelace Brain Mapping Center at UCLA. His research investigates the human mirror neuron system and its role in social behavior and its disorders. Marco's research has been covered by many publications, such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and major TV networks. We are thankful to have Dr. Iacoboni here with us today. Marco, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and about how the mirror neuron system connects to sport fandom?
My training, I'm a neurologist and a neuroscientist. My training led me to get in touch with these people that discovered mirror cells in the monkey brain. And I thought, okay, can we actually study the same thing using brain imaging and brain stimulation in humans? And I got into that field. It was a lot of fun, it still is. And then really one thing led to another. And one aspect of mirroring means really that whenever you see someone making an action, your own brain says they would make that action if you actually were executing the action, are also mildly activated in your brain, even though you're not making the action, just watching it. And one of the interpretation of this phenomenon, which was initially fairly surprising, because we were thinking that, perception and action were separate in the brain, and it turns out that these cells were actually define our beliefs that they're separate in the brain, perception and action. The idea is that, well, it allows you to do a few things. Number one, you can actually get into the mind of other people just by simulating in your own brain what they're doing just by watching them. Second of all, it can help you also predicting what people will be doing next, which is also very helpful for social behavior. And finally, it can really make you sort of empathizing with other people. And that's one aspect that we've been following more, especially recently, because there is an emerging sense that social cognition and empathy are really cornerstone of social behavior. And when they are impaired, they are also a cornerstone of mental illness, which is something that we want to sort of work on and get, ameliorate mental illness in patients. So that's the main, academic and research focus. But of course, it also leads to other, this discovery leads to other things like fandom. Why people get so excited watching sport events, and they divide themselves in different factions. And of course, mirroring is one of those aspects that I've been often asked to comment on when it comes to fandom. And I actually like sports. My favorite sport is tennis, but being Italian, of course, I like soccer a lot, and also basketball. I played basketball when I was young back in Italy. Was when my generation back then, there weren't too many kids that were playing basketball, but it's one thing that I really like. And then, one aspect of fandom is that it really generates a lot of emotions, which is something very good. It can turn into a negative thing if the emotions then become so negative that people start fighting with each other. But fundamentally, it's one of the reasons why sport is so popular. It's because you can vicariously sort of feel that you're doing the action that the athletes are doing on the field. But also, it really gives you all these emotions that are something that humans like to have emotions, especially positive ones. And again, that the tricky part is to really be careful in not flipping from positive to negative emotions and becoming angry at the opposite teams and fans, and really in trying to enjoy it in a way.
So just to see if I understand correctly, the mirror neuron system responds to things that other people do that are kind of like things that we would do, and links us to the emotions that might be related to those actions.
Yeah, actually, to give you an example of what we're doing now, we're just talking, right? And yet, when I'm talking, your motor speech areas, the ones that you use when you actually talk yourself, are also mildly activated. We've done brain imaging studies that show that. We've also shown that with brain stimulation, that if you knock down those regions, your capacity to perceive speech is actually reduced. So it's not just some internal parroting that has no relevance to understanding. It's important also for understanding. So yeah, that's what basically the phenomenon of mirroring. It's exactly that. The fact that even when you're perceiving other people's doing things, the same brain areas that are activated when you actually do those things are activated in your brain, just a little less, so you don't really overtly mimic what they do.
Right, you're not experiencing the thing that they're doing, you're observing it, and so the reactions are a little bit less.
Right, and it's some sort of vicarious experience, and of course it's important it's vicarious because if you were going to say the same things I would be saying now, it would be very dysfunctional. We wouldn't have a conversation, back and forth. So you need to sort of tone it down. But in a way, it's a simulation process in your own brain of what I'm saying when it comes to language, or what I'm doing when it comes to action, or what I'm feeling. And when I show my emotion with my face, what I'm feeling, also it's a vicarious experience or simulation in your own brain of the same things I'm expressing with my body that are related to emotions.
That's really interesting. I want to ask one more question before we move to our next speaker. So with fan behavior, say I'm a basketball fan and I'm really engaged in March Madness. Now, I've never been a college varsity basketball player or an NBA player. I've never played at nearly that level. If you saw me on a basketball court, you'd be embarrassed. But are you saying that the mirror neuron system is part of what allows me to engage with the experience of playing basketball and the experience of sport with an audience and with the excitement of the game that I'm observing?
Totally. I mean, even when you're in your living room watching the game on TV by yourself, you'll find yourself probably doing a little jump whenever there is a jump shot from one of your players or a defensive move. It's something that really, it allows you to be part of the experience in a much more personal and sort of bodily oriented way, which is, fun.
We'll come back to that. Our next speaker is Nathan Kallman Lamb, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick. Nathan's work sits at the intersection of social theory and the sociology of sport, with a particular focus on labor, racism, and exploitation. In addition to his research, Nathan is the co-host of the End of Sport podcast and a frequent contributor to The Guardian, The Chronicle of Higher Education, Time Magazine, and other public venues. We're so glad Dr. Kallman Lamb could join us for this conversation. Nathan, could you share with us a bit more about your current research around sport and spectatorship?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you folks today. And I'm coming at this really from a very different angle in that I'm really trying to take a sociological perspective and think about how issues around sport and fandom relate to social theoretical questions. And so I would start by saying that my research on fandom has to be understood within the larger political economy of high revenue sport. What I've tried to do in my book, Game Misconduct, Injury, Fandom, and the Business of Sport, and the scholarly articles I published in this area, is to connect fandom or sports spectatorship to the athletic work that produces the commodity spectacle that fans consume. So in this sense, my work on fandom needs to be understood in the context always of a concern for the exploitative and harmful features of athletic labor. And indeed, my current project is focused on the experiences of former college football players. I'm happy to talk about that more later, if folks are interested. In my own previous research on fandom, I conducted semi-structured interviews with former professional hockey players and fans of hockey. And this is in addition to the current work that I'm doing with former college football players. This form of qualitative research provides a window into the way that the political economies of high-performance spectator sport, highly lucrative political economies predicated on a market that is fandom, generate meaning for fans, but often at significant and seldom fully appreciated cost to the athletes who do the work that makes fandom possible. My central claim in Game Misconduct, based on my work with athletes and fans, is that spectator sport flourishes as a form of culture and as a commodity spectacle in advanced capitalist North America because it offers fans a sense of meaning within the context of a social structure that systematically isolates and alienates. To a certain extent, this meaning comes from the vicarious pleasure and satisfaction of winning or succeeding through the athlete, what you were already talking about. As the fan comes to identify with them, with the athlete becomes an avatar for the team. The athlete becomes an avatar for the fan. But it's more than that. For what I argue that fandom really offers is a supplementary sense of community. This is what the historian Benedict Anderson called imagined community in writing about The Nation. Sports spectatorship offers fans the sense that they're part of a community of people larger than themselves. A we, so to speak, right, that fans quite literally articulate in speaking about that team. That sense then of collectivity is rehearsed through the acquisition of team merchandise and memorabilia, through the kind of collective chants that occur in the stadium, through team message boards and so forth, all of which in a sense reify, or let's to say concretize, the imagined community of fandom into something that is very real and very material for the fan. And in the process, that satiates the desire for meaning and collectivity that capitalism systematically denies. Yet, and this is critical, this entire imaginative construct is predicated on the work of athletes. And that work must at least have the illusion of high stakes, even life or death stakes. For if the fan were to have the impression that the athletic context they so invest in are inherently meaningless, no more important than a pickup game at the park, then these spectacles would no longer be capable of sustaining the emotional burden that fandom invests in them. And that's precisely why fans are so often enraged to see players refusing to play through injury or tough it out. Something I witnessed growing up in Toronto with former NBA player Vince Carter, for those who are familiar with him, who was essentially run out of town because he chose to take care of his body, because when he had serious knee injuries, he decided it was more important to heal, right, and care for himself than to just play through it no matter what, to sacrifice himself for the team. And that made fans enraged. For these sorts of reasons, injury in my reading is more than just an unfortunate byproduct of high-performance spectator sport. Rather, it's a structural feature required in order to generate the meaning fans need to build their imagined communities. As such, extreme harm is in fact part of what makes spectator sport so compelling for fans. And that was something really brought to the fore during the Spectacle of Harm experience by Buffalo Bill Damar Hamlin this year, which is again something we could talk about later if folks are interested. Now, just as a final note before we move on to the Q&A portion and so forth, I would add, and I hope that we can further discuss this, the particular context we are discussing today, which is to say March Madness. And March Madness really falls within the scope of my current research into college sports. And my current research project contends that all of the issues I've been raising here are significantly magnified in the context of big-time college sport, for instance, the NCAA basketball tournaments. Because in this situation, we are talking about unpaid and disproportionately racialized college students who are performing the athletic labor that sustains a billion-dollar industry. This means for me that exploitation is a defining feature of college sport, and that the harm that comes to athletes in the context of their work here is an additional non-economic form of exploitation, one that is sanctioned by institutions of higher education accredited to nurture and develop, not harm. And again, this is an issue not unrelated to fandom, for it's evident that the exploitative and harmful dynamics of college athletics would not be possible in their current form without the market that fandom provides. In that sense, fans, whether they mean to or not, participate in an exploitative system. It also means that when fans, as a function of their emotional investments as part of the imagined communities of college athletics, direct abuse, whether in the stadium or online, at college athletes who fail to fulfill the fans' fantasies of success, they are directing that abuse at, and thus actively producing, harm for college students, a dynamic that would never be tolerated in, for instance, a college classroom. Thanks.
That is a really fascinating portrayal of fandom, sort of starting with the idea that people are looking for connection, whether that relates to their college experience or to something that they developed an affinity for in childhood. People are looking for these communities to be a part of, and they feel so strongly about being part of these communities that they're willing to let the players in those communities go to war and destroy their bodies and, you know, sacrifice their brains literally for the sake of satisfying these community relations. And
yes, Derek, do you want to just respond to that really quickly?
Yeah.
I think one thing that we should be considering that you're underlining, which is really helpful, is that sometimes people make an assumption that sports fandom is almost an aesthetic experience, right? And what we're really getting at here is that the way in which the more extreme, but also the more lucrative, I would say, forms of fandom operate is not aesthetic. People don't come to sports. They could, but they don't come to sports because it's just pleasurable to see bodies in motion, right? Doing amazing things. That is there in sport. I'm not denying that at all. I think that there is a way in which sports could entirely be consumed like dance, right? As an aesthetic process. And that actually might be a more healthier and more humane way of consuming sport. But that's not the way it typically happens. And because of that, that's where this sort of sacrificial piece comes in, because the fan needs the athlete to be willing to go to those extreme lengths in order for it to be something more, an actual community and not just an aesthetic experience.
That is fascinating. And I look forward to delving into many of the pieces of that. I want to pose a question, and for these questions, I hope both of you will feel free to jump in with your take on the answer to the question. So, and maybe you've already answered bits of this, but I want to ask more succinctly, why do people become fans?
Okay, so let me give a first shot at it. I think, first of all, yeah, there is an aspect of we live in a society, right? We are agents in a society. So that's an important component. So there's some sort of contagious aspect of fandom. You grow up in a community in which everybody is, supporting one team or another. So that becomes something that eventually, even just as a kid, you are going to take a position to become either, when it comes to, was born and grew up in Rome, Roma versus Lazio, the two soccer teams in Rome. That's almost like it's part of your experience growing up. So that seems to be, it's almost inevitable. There's a lot of the things we do as social agents that are just transmitted through cultural aspects, to, again, contagiousness, to empathizing with people that are close to you. That it's almost, it's not, I don't really see, it's, I would say it's something you can't avoid. I mean, I would say indeed there are very few people that I know of, and being in academia, actually, you have some that are really not interested in sports and are not really fans, but those are really the minority of people in our society. And that's because, again, it's so pervasive that there is no way you're not going to take a position aside and belong to one group or another. Even a very mild, I would say, fans are still, they feel it's part of them. And again, there's a component of the contagiousness aspect of being an agent in a society that it's you can't really avoid it.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just build on what Marco's saying there, because I think I agree with that as a key principle to understand. Just to slightly rephrase it in my own way of thinking about it, right? Like, there's no doubt that socialization is part of what leads us to fandom. And in other words, if I was to speak in terms of imagined communities, which I was before, right? And I'm saying these imagined communities, well, they become institutions in their own right? If they're originally conceived of as imagined communities and that there's nothing inherent about them, they become structures that are formed so that they become Lazio and Roma and so forth, right? Over time, these communities that exist and that we are invited to socialize ourselves through. And because of the power of sport in our society as a form of culture, this is something that children are exposed to, and they feel that it is in fact one of the institutions in their world that they can become socialized into. And it's natural, as Marco said, it feels natural for that process to take place, right? But then the other side of it that I just want to add to that, so that's really not contradicting that, but just to kind of build on it, then there's also the question, so why are these institutions seductive, right? Why is it that some people do in fact choose, like they're invited to interpolate themselves through fandom in the way we're describing, but sometimes that's resisted, right? Some of the things that invite us to interpolate ourselves through, we don't end up doing that. We develop our own identities that have different interests and so forth. And yet sports fandom is one that is obviously tremendously compelling, right? And that is why it is the most popular sport of culture in North America today. And to me, that's where I come back to these questions around capitalism. Sport can exist in other contexts. Obviously, it exists in putatively socialist societies. It exists in pre-capitalist societies. I mean, we've seen there's a trans-historical element to sports existence, undoubtedly. But we also have to be very specific. If we're talking about this society we're in right now, right? What is the appeal of sport here and now? And for me, that has a great deal to do with the conditions that capitalism produces for people in their day-to-day lives. And if those conditions have to do with the sort of monotony and the drudgery of work, very lengthy work weeks and work days, time away from family members, work lives that put us in exchange relationships all the time, those exchange relationships are very isolating. And they can be very alienating in that sense. And that creates, I think, because there is a fundamental sort of human desire for community, for connection. That is where pleasure comes from, those forms of connection. And because we are denied that by our social structure, we go looking for it, right? We go looking for it in the places where we can find it. And these institutions of fandom offer that potential. Now, there's really the question of whether they provide the full gratification that they sort of promise, in a sense. I think that's an interesting question, but they certainly are seductive in the sense that they feel like, where are we now, right? We're part of this team, part of this larger collectivity. We're wearing the same clothes. We can walk through the street and high five each other because we're all part of the same thing. And that's pleasurable, right? That gives us something that is denied. And so to me, it stands to reason that sports fandom would become such a popular form of culture in an advanced capitalist society.
Yeah, well, just add a comment here. Yeah, there's also an aspect of identity, though. I mean, I grew up in Rome, but I've been at UCLA for 30 years. I'm a UCLA professor. And of course, I feel that I root for UCLA teams, all sorts of teams, although I often just watch, basketball and tennis, which are currently my favorite sports here. It's part of who you are. If you belong to a higher education institution in which you are one of the faculty, then it's the feel that you want to sort of affirm your own identity by having your teams succeeding. That doesn't deny all the things that Nathan said, that those are actually very thoughtful comments that he made, that we should really think about these things a lot, the things that Nathan pointed out. I think we are sort of in a society which we often don't think about these things, but these are the things that actually affect our daily life a lot. So those are really good comments. But there's also an aspect of identity. I'm a UCLA professor. That's what I am. Even though I grew up in a different continent, I wasn't even thinking of coming here. Then I really loved it and it stayed here for 30 years, half of my life, basically. So it's part of me. And that, what happens to the UCLA teams, in a way, it also affects me because it's my identity.
No, that's great, Marco. I'm sorry. I want to actually respond to you again, because I think you got me thinking here too. There's a really interesting question around community and identity there, right? Because I was talking about the Imagine community. And if we think of something like the Toronto Raptors, right? Or the Los Angeles Clippers or whatever it is, right? There's a way in which, we have this geographical space in which people might be connected to one another, right? But we know that most people in Los Angeles don't actually come into, direct proximity with one another. So it's a very imagined form of community in that sense. But the university community is a little bit different potentially, right? And there's actually a way in which the university relies on a sense of community, and it relies on it as an alumni base and so forth, right? And for me, and for you perhaps, Marco, like I had students in my classes who were athletes, right? So that's a direct form of connection and community. That's one kind of community. But then there's the sense of the person who went to Duke, let's say, 20 years ago, and me. We have no real connection in our lives to one another. But the Duke basketball, hypothetically, could suture us together in a way, could bring us together. And that's sort of like the power that sport has for the university community itself.
But it's more than that, right? Like, people aren't just finding connection. People are behaving in ways that they would never behave in everyday life when it comes to their support of their teams. People dress up in the regalia, people paint their bodies with the colors of the team, people get in fights in stadiums, people take their frustrations and their joys about the outcome of a game well into their private lives, which can lead to celebration and conflict. So why are these fan relationships so powerful and so behaviorally potent?
Okay, I'll give you a little, what's my take on that. I think we don't just do it for sports. We do also for other things. We can dress it up for things like that are more social, like Halloween here in the States, or Carnival in Italy. If you go to Venice during the Carnival, it looks like an enchanted magic place. Everybody's in costume. So we don't do it only for sports, but of course, sport events, they happen almost daily, certainly on a weekly basis, and they unify people. So it's a strong form of cohesiveness and generates all these other things. And again, I think that there's also an aspect that Nita was talking about, how the daily life can be very boring, and so you want to emotions are a great thing to go through, and so having these vicarious emotions, having this almost artificial way of having positive or negative emotions, either reaches our lives anyway. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are so willing to do that with sports, but also because sports are really pervasive. I mean, again, when it comes to Halloween, it happens only one day a year. Sports happens every week, all sorts of sports. So it allows you to do these things on a more regular basis. But I think that there are some common phenomena between being into a Halloween or a carnival and being a sport fan that dresses up with colors to hero his own team.
Yeah, no, again, I really agree with Marco here. We can use the word, just building on what he said, carnival. It's carnivalesque, right? That's what we sort of see playing out in this athletic context. This is an opportunity to break out of the kind of the norms that confine us in a day-to-day sense. And so we see this sort of expression of emotion and enthusiasm and pleasure. And it's tolerant. I mean, like, think about the phenomenon, which is a very American phenomenon, the phenomenon of tailgating. Right? I mean, like, what is tailgating but this opportunity for people to get lubricated, to enter this space, a parking lot, whatever the space is, right? But just like really abandon their regular identity, their day-to-day identities, and kind of become someone else, assume this identity within the team. And I think it gets at everything we've been talking about so far, right? All the kind of the sense of satisfaction that comes from this form of community and all of that. But yes, sport allows us to step out of our regular selves. And I think Marco has a follow-up, so I'm going to turn it over to him in a second. But I also think we want to come back to, though, there are also certain types of behaviors that sport does socialize us into, right? So it's not totally random, the kinds of behaviors. So if we start to talk about things like aggression and violence and things like that, which emerge as one aspect of the fandom's kind of performance, that is intimately connected to the kind of culture produced through sport. And I do think that's something we should get back to.
And also there's some aspect of the sports behavior that is almost ritualistic. I mean, the Buffalo Bills fans, they do something seriously crazy. Now I don't remember, they throw themselves onto tables or something. Don't they do that? And the first time I found that out, this is insane. But I guess they must have fun when they do that. But there's a ritualistic aspect into it. I mean, it's something that becomes a ritual, belonging to that community, doing that thing, even at the cost of maybe injuring yourself.
That's right. And thinking about those rituals, let me go back to Duke for a second. At Duke, there's a couple of rituals that I didn't know before I came on campus. One, if the team wins in the right context, I believe it's if the men's basketball team wins a home game against North Carolina, they burn their benches in front of the student residences, right? So that's part of the tradition, and it's like sanctioned by the university. They get permits for it and they burn it, right? But I mean, like, that is really a ritualistic kind of carnivalesque moment. And at the same time, another practice I didn't realize is that students will live in a tent city for months on campus so that they can get the tickets to the UNC game, right? Because everyone wants to be inside the stadium for that game, and there are not enough tickets to go around for the entire student body. They literally live in tents. So again, though, that tenting practice becomes part of a ritual. And you think, you're paying $80,000 of tuition and residence fees to go to Duke University, and you're spending a third of the year living in a tent outside, right? But sport does that to people. There's the meaning that they accrue from doing that makes it well worth it. That's actually what they came for.
Yeah. I remember a few days ago, I was walking to the tennis court early in the morning, and I see this long line of UCLA students all in line, sleeping on the boardwalk just because they wanted to get into the stadium to watch a basketball game with Arizona.
So let's turn the perspective for a second to the student athletes who are a part of this. And with recent changes to NCAA policy and realignment of conferences and name, image, and likeness deals, what is the current state of the political economy, as you put it, for the student athlete in these fan situations?
Go ahead, Nathan. That's your thing. I want to just say one thing. When I heard that UCLA moved to the Big Ten, I thought, what? It doesn't make any sense. We are on the Pacific Coast. But, I guess money talks.
That's exactly right. Money talks, right? And just, I mean, obviously, I could talk all day about this, so I will try to be more precise. But just to respond to that specific point that you were making, we use the term, Derek, student athlete, right? But the student athlete is a student first, ostensibly, right? And how is it that a student in Los Angeles can be flying to New Jersey, right, in the middle of a school week to play a game? It doesn't make sense. There's no possible way in which they can get the student experience that they're promised there. And so as Marco said, right, like money talks, and it really teaches us a lot about the real dynamics that stand behind the sort of the rhetoric around the student athlete. But let's talk about this sort of name, image, and likeness piece and the whole kind of context impacting how athletes and fans view college sport. So the general statement I want to start with about NIL is that although it has spawned a veritable moral panic, I think, in terms of the revolutionary threat it ostensibly poses to college sport, my position has always been and continues to be that NIL, name, image, and likeness, is really a fig leaf for the exploitation in college sport as we know it. Because NIL simply affords athletes the basic right enjoyed by all other Americans, right? The right to perform promotional labor and be compensated for it. That's all it means. What it does not do in any way, shape, or form is disrupt or challenge the basic exploitative dynamic at the heart of big-time college sport, which is the fact that athletes produce a tremendous amount of revenue for universities and the NCAA and receive only educational compensation in the form of scholarships in return. And nothing whatsoever about that dynamic has changed here. So one very problematic consequence of this development, in my view, is that many fans now perceive college athletes to be appropriately compensated. And that's harmful for at least a couple of reasons. First, it means that it's harder to underline and politicize the exploitation in college sport because there is an increased perception among athletes and fans alike that the exploitation no longer exists due to the fact that money is flowing to some athletes through NIL. The other key problem is that NIL furthers the idea that college athletes are paid employees and should be treated accordingly. Now, let me say that I do not believe compensation means that any athletes in any context should be subject to abuse from fans or coaches or anyone else. Nevertheless, one of the problems with high-performance sport as we know it is that this perception does exist. And you know this if you go to any athletic event and you hear people, let's say, heckling from the seats, right? This means that college athletes are now even likelier to be subjected to that kind of treatment from fans, both in the stadium and online. And again, I want to come back to the point I started with today, which is that college athletes are students without any employment rights. They do not have the right to compensation, occupational health and safety provisions, or collective bargaining. They're quite literally students who happen to be doing the work that generates a billion-dollar industry. But they're students nonetheless, and therefore, for me, it's absolutely unacceptable for students to be subjected to harm in the course of their educational work. And frankly, according to the logic of college sport as it exists today, March Madness is an educational experience. That's what the NCAA actually tells us by saying they are student athletes. So those being educated should be protected from harm and abuse in their education, but they aren't. And that's my problem.
That is a really powerful statement. I want to sort of expand on that, and Marco, maybe you'll have something to say about this, about the physical harm that players often experience by playing their sport at this level. Particularly what we've heard from, former NFL players having very serious neurological damage that leads to psychiatric conditions and suicide risk as they age. You mentioned earlier, Nathan, about the fact that many fans deride athletes who make the choice to protect their bodies. Why do you think people feel empowered to do that?
Okay, so first of all, let's also say that it's true, especially some sports, American football, clearly, you just look at it and you know that it can be good for the brain. And now we have plenty of evidence for that. And some other sports too. But also let's say that actually doing physical activity, we have plenty of evidence. It's actually good for you, keeping yourself healthy and also your brain healthy much longer by being physically active. But yeah, certainly there's an aspect of extreme agonism that can generate repeated injuries. And there's this push, as Nathan was saying, that, well, you're injured, you need to heal, but can we make it a little shorter? And then there's the mentality that, kind of pushes you to sort of get back into the game maybe sooner than you should. And then the aspect of, I think, again, it's probably what Nathan was saying at the beginning, there's almost an aspect of war into especially college sports, in which the fans really feel that you're not willing to sacrifice your body for the greater cause, which is winning the title or whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, I absolutely echo what Marco's saying here, and it's an excellent question because it gets at the heart of the kind of dynamics I'm trying to talk about. And certainly, my work focuses on football for a reason, right? Because it's such an extreme form of all of this sort of harm. We know that football players basically cannot escape their experiences in the sport without brain damage, right? Like it's actually a structural feature of participating in football, just because even when there isn't traumatic brain injury in the form of concussions, we have the repeated contact that takes place, and we know that that is harmful to the brain, right? And yet football is the most popular form of sport in the United States today, right? And there's the most money in football. So clearly, going back to what you're asking, Derek, there's a way in which we've accepted that, right? There's a way in which fans do feel that there's a kind of level of entitlement to the sacrifice of the athlete. And to me, part of how that, I think there are probably a number of ways of addressing this question, but I do think we're sometimes not conscious enough of what I would call the sports media complex. And that is the ways in which those who cover, as a business, cover sports, right? And that's from the ESPNs of the world to the Athletic to all of the different businesses built around talking about and broadcasting and marketing sport, right? All of these businesses rely on that commodity spectacle. They rely on that sport. They wouldn't have their business if the players weren't playing, in other words, right? And so because of that, it is in the interests of these businesses to promote a form of sport that elicits the maximum amount of that caters to the market most effectively. The market is fans, right? And if fans derive satisfaction from players sacrificing themselves, it's the job of the media, in a sense, to say, we should celebrate the play. You notice this, just go look at, especially in playoff season in any sport, the celebration of the athlete who plays through injury, right? It's not necessarily that the focus is always on the person who chose not to play. Although if it's like the player who doesn't play in a bowl game in college football, there's a lot of backlash in the media to that player, right? But it's also the quarterback, it turns out he had a broken leg or something, but he toughed it out, right? And played in the second half. And he becomes a hero in that moment, right? He really is. He's deified by the media, and in turn, fans pick up on that, because this goes back to what Marco was saying. We are socialized into a culture, and the child, the young person, that's the framework through which you come to experience sport, that you should be playing through pain. That is what this is all about. That's what this is a celebration of, right? And so you get to the point, that's where the entitlement kicks in, right? That you expect it because that's part of the fabric of what makes high performance sport.
Kind of reminds me of in ancient human history, we had these sacrificial rituals. And almost there is a connection there between sacrificing someone in the community to the gods and sacrificing the athlete to the greater cause, which is winning the match.
I think that's exactly right. No, I really do. I think that's nicely put. Yeah.
So it's interesting to me also that these relationships that you're talking about extend to so-called non-revenue generating sports when they become revenue generating. We see this every 4 years in the Olympics with gymnastics, for example, when you see athletes putting themselves in serious physical harm for the sake of their sport, and performing while injured because of the circumstances surrounding their training. And once every 4 years, the media focuses attention on these particular sports, and suddenly these people become heroes. I wanted to kind of segue from that into a brief discussion about equity, diversity, and inclusion in sport. In light of the fact that this is only the second year that the NCAA women's basketball tournament has been conducted in the same format as the men's tournament, I wanted to ask if there are any differences that either of you have found in terms of the fandom experience between women and men, or between people of different ethnic backgrounds.
Well, I have to say that being a tennis fan, tennis was been one of the sport that was very early on was actually very aware of the notion of trying to equalize things between female and male athletes. And I guess some sports lend themselves more than others to this. It seems to me maybe basketball is one of those sports in which actually the male performance is for many years been considered more engaging somehow. I actually didn't even know that only in the last 2 years, NCAA actually used the same format for both. There is an aspect, there is a culture. I mean, I believe is there a female version of American football? I don't even know, but I'm assuming there are some sports that are considered just a little more difficult for the female body. But in terms of equalizing things, of course, the more we do that, the better it is. And I think the culture will change more and more because we are more aware of these differences and the idea that we should probably treat people with more equality for sure. Diversity, I would say, some sports, it seems to me, are more naturally inclined to embrace diversity because of cultural aspects of, or even differences in body structure that may help people to perform better in certain sports according to their genetic endowment. So it seems to me that diversity may not be so much of an issue, although even that I'm thinking there are some sports that are so white that you would think they would require an injection of diversity too. Think about, fencing. Fencing seems to me that the kind of sport that it's often just mostly white.
Well, thanks, Michael. I have a lot to say on this question. So first thing, let me just say, I'm not quite sure about the second year piece of the question with respect to the women's tournament. What has changed certainly is that there have been a lot of issues in terms of the inequity of resource allocation from the NCAA to the men's and women's tournament. But the format itself, I'm not sure has changed so dramatically. But there are huge differences in terms of the political economies of fandom in terms of men's and women's sport, and when Marco was getting at this, and I think we really want to talk this through. So, and I should say this is not my precise area of expertise, but a lot of work has been done by others in this area. What I will note to begin with is that there is a popular notion here that Marco was getting at, that men's sports, and his example of tennis was actually very good in a lot of ways. So let me just sort of point to that, and we can maybe come back to that. But there's a popular notion that men's sports have more fandom in general because people are more interested in watching men play. I'm not making the claim that is inherently true. I'm saying that is a popular kind of commonsensical notion about fandom in the context of gendered sport. But now this idea has been roundly challenged and debunked by scholars who point to the fact that all forms of athletic commodity spectacle require significant marketing and investment in order to succeed. Sports spectacle does not become popular because of its inherent magnetism. It becomes popular when it is identified as a form of potential revenue and value production, and thus receives concomitant forms of investment. That's how the most successful men's leagues have been built over decades, mind you, okay? It does not happen overnight. Women's sport, on the other hand, has received far less investment and far less coverage. The single biggest factor in the relative popularity of sports is how much broadcast coverage and discussion in sports media it receives. Women's sports receive almost no coverage at all historically, okay? Like we're talking like 1% to 99% on SportsCenter. This has begun to change, okay? And those are some of the changes we're talking about. We're seeing, for instance, in the women's tournament, we are certainly seeing more marketing of the women's tournament. We're seeing more broadcasting of it and so forth. So this is a change that is beginning, but we are in the very early stages of this change, okay? And yet, even so, we're already seeing a really considerable, even radical increase in the popularity of women's sport, correlating with the fact that, quite simply, it is being shown to people, right? It is becoming available, and that allows people to cultivate fandoms. So that's all to say, I don't think there's an inherent difference in the possibilities for fandom between men's and women's sport. And again, I'm gonna hit another point, but to circle back to tennis, tennis is an example of this. Women's tennis is celebrated. It has long been given marketing right? Coverage, there's been funding, and women's tennis thrives, right? It's a really good example of what is possible. Okay, then we have the additional really interesting question, and this is less theorized and researched, of the qualitative differences between men's and women's sports fandom. I don't mean the games themselves, I mean the fandom itself. Okay, so my provisional answer to this question is there are significant differences to the experiences of fandom in women's sport versus men's sport precisely because of the economic considerations I've just been addressing. Because women's sport has been underfunded and underappreciated, fans in women's sport are more concerned with questions of solidarity, both among themselves as fans and between fans and the athletes they support. Their interest is more oriented towards the growth of the sport and a celebration of it in the context of a society that does not appreciate it. So again, that's not an essential difference between women's sport and fandom and men's, right? It wouldn't have to exist, but it's a contingent difference based on social and economic context. But what is also notable to me is that women's sport thus offers a glimpse, really, into a more humane mode of fandom, given that it is less predicated on the dehumanization and instrumentalization of the athlete. But then, ironically, if women's sport achieves the relative economic hegemony of men's sport that is sought, we may see increasing instrumentalization and dehumanization, albeit coming with improved wages and working conditions. So that's obviously a very long meditation on the gender side, but I would also say a quick word about race. I would love to, but don't have much to say about race and fandom per se. But I do want to comment, especially as we're talking about college sport, that one thing we have to be really, really mindful of in the context of college sport is that the athletic workers, the students, we call student athletes, but I call campus athletic workers, okay? These campus athletic workers who are producing the spectacle of college sport are massively disproportionately racialized, okay? What I mean by that is the participation of Black athletes, men and women, massively outstrips both their ability to participate in predominantly white institutions of the Power 5 conferences. That is, their Black students are underrepresented overall in the student population of predominantly white institutions relative to the population of the United States as a whole. But in fact, when it comes to athletics, they are way overrepresented. In a lot of these sports, more than 50% of the athletic participants are Black, right? When the number in the country is more like 13% as a whole. And you have to look at that, and then you have to look at the revenue being produced and where the revenue goes to. We call these nonprofit institutions. They're universities, so they should be nonprofit institutions ideally, right? In the public sector especially, but also in the private universities like Duke. But there are people, when the athletic department receives revenue, that revenue goes somewhere. It has to get spent. If you have an athletic department making $200 million plus a year, and there are many such athletic departments, that money goes somewhere. And one of the places it goes to is coaches, athletic department administrators, can find its way to university presidents. These are folks who are disproportionately white. Again, not representative of the overall population of the United States, more white than the overall population. And because of that, we have what is called a racial transfer of wealth directly from Black athletes to white administrative folks. And that racial transfer of wealth has been estimated at $1.1 to $1.3 billion a year. Okay, that's the kind of money we're talking about. And so for me, we have characterized this, me and my colleagues on our podcast, we've characterized this as a real recurrence of the plantation dynamics that are occurring in the context of college sport, because we are seeing extraction of value based on race. And it is not something that is morally sustainable within our system of higher education and athletics.
That is a really great analysis. Before we end, I wanted to sort of pose that we've talked about fandom as being a phenomenon that taps into deep-seated needs for belonging and connection. And those deep-seated needs have a neural basis. But the fandom experience is also in some ways compromised and turns maybe a little bit toxic because of the economics that drive sports in general in this country. So is there a way, in your opinion, to make fandom more humane and more healthy for both the fans and the players?
Oh yeah, there should be, but it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. One thing I want to say, a positive about fandom, going back to the issue of race, and this is like probably the answer I'm going to give you also to your questions. What we call cognitive reframing, and cognitive reframing means really seeing things from a different point of view. One of my favorite dudes in the history of mankind is Marcus Aurelius. He was writing things for himself, basically memos to himself, that became one of the most read books in the history of mankind, Meditations. And one thing he wrote is that if I think about myself as Marcus, I think about my city as Rome. But if I think about myself as a human being, then my city is the whole world, the whole planet. And so when it comes to fandom, for instance, to go back to race, fandom makes people of different races, they realize that they have something in common. So they go beyond the very silly artificial thing, which is skin color or other aspects of race. And so they realize you can actually reassess differences in terms of actually similar identities, similarities. So that's an important aspect of it. Of course, again, the flip side is that then you become divisive with other people. So that seems to me that it's something, and when it comes to making it, can we flip it and become a positive experience? Seems to me that that's, again, something that can easily be done. First of all, if you go to watch a football game, you have to realize that even if there are people that root for the other team, you both you and the other fans of the other team, you both love the game. So there's something really in common between all of you. So why do we have to actually fight? There is no reason to do that. You can actually embrace the game as something that you really enjoy together. And, sometimes you're going to win, sometimes you're going to lose. You can make the experience much more positive. Because again, we talked about, your team loses and you go into sort of depression, you're moody for the rest of the day at the very least. You can change that. It can be easily changed by, again, doing some sort of cognitive framing, which you think, well, we lost this time, we may win the next time, but we embrace, it was a great time together. We spent hours together having these vicarious emotions, vicarious even athletic gestures. So you can actually look at the positive thing, but one aspect of our society also thrives onto the divisiveness of sports in other aspects of society too. But yes, we have this need to belong. So you can actually think about belonging in a much larger sense, which is belonging to the community of people that love that particular sport.
Yeah, no, I really want to, I think, echo what Marco's saying, and I'll put it in my slightly different terms. But, Marco started by saying it's hard, and I think that's right. It is hard because these economic imperatives have a tremendous role in terms of the socialization process and the ways in which sport is framed and so forth. We haven't talked about it, but we should really be thinking about things like gambling and the way that gambling has become an increasing part of this world and the harm that ultimately inflicts on both the fan and the athlete, right? These are just another toxic ingredient in the mix. So there's a lot to work against, but I think in working towards what Marco was describing, which is a greater sense of solidarity, instead of it being fractious, right? And we have these antagonisms that emerge through sport because there's the in-group, the out-group, us against them, right? There is also a way in which we can understand forms of solidarity through sport. And one of those ways to me is, especially because I'm so concerned about the athlete spectator dynamic, right? In the way in which the athlete becomes his avatar for the spectator. And there's a way in which the spectator then comes to just be willing, right? To sacrifice that athlete and move on to the next person. And that's where the dehumanization happens because it's an instrumental relationship. But if we can cultivate with a cognitive reframing, if we can cultivate a different way of seeing the athlete actually as this person who is bringing you pleasure, right? If you're really on their team, you should care about them because if that's your family member or friend and they get hurt, that matters to you, right? So if we can kind of, and I think that this is true, that in situations where there's a less spectacular element to sport, which is to say that people are brought closer together, right? Instead of viewing from afar in this way, this very simulated way, to come closer to each other. If you're a fan who's in the same community in a real sense as the athlete and come to know them as a person, then you care about their interests and they're bringing you pleasure. So it's I kind of joked about, well, we don't go to the park and watch something happen at the park and then build a community about it. But that is actually the best of sport, right? Like literally going to the park or going to see a basketball game, like, you know, in New York City, where people are just playing. There's no real thing that's been preconceived, but it's like, it's really fun to watch people playing basketball and people get excited, but also you're kind of a community there who are experiencing that, right? So if we can see the aesthetic side of sports more, and we can see how like we all do share this love and kind of come closer together, there is a lot of potential in sports and fandom for some of the better aspects of human nature, but it's very difficult in a capitalist society to get to that point. So I don't know if I have a roadmap for how we make it better, but like the potential is there.
Well, I could go on talking about this for hours, but we are out of time. Marco, Nathan, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on this topic, which is obviously surrounding us right now as we go through March Madness. To our audience, thank you so much, science fans, for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed hearing from our distinguished speakers. We'll be sending you a 1-minute survey after the broadcast. We really value your feedback, so let us know how we're doing. Feel free to share topics for future showcases, and feel free to email us at science@apa.org with your recommendations. If you like what you saw, join us on a monthly basis for Science Showcase, where we will continue to discuss timely issues in psychological science. We also encourage you to subscribe to our Editor's Choice newsletter so you can receive more information about psychology research. And we urge you to subscribe to Science Spotlight, your source for the most relevant news and information for psychological scientists by psychological scientists. Special thanks to our speakers. We deeply appreciate your time and support. A huge shout out to our production team. You make this happen, and I'm so pleased to work with all of you. And most of all, thanks to you, our viewers. We're here for you, and we hope to see you at our upcoming events. I'm Derek Snyder with Science Showcase, and I wish you a good day.